Hello, I'm Tom Foti from New York 9/11 Truth. Can you hear me okay? That's cool. Are you speaking? I just want to say first, it's good to see a lot of you here. I know being in the 9/11 movement, a lot of us get preoccupied with the demolitions and with the Air Force standing down and with all the other intricate matters and facts about 9/11 that contradict the official story. Um, but in truth, 9/11 was about money. As Jerry said, 9/11 was, and people think that Bush and Cheney did 9/11 themselves so they could rally support to go into Afghanistan and Iraq and get the American people behind all these wars, and the oil and control the oil and so on. And there's truth to that, okay? But if you look at other false flag incidents, like Oklahoma City, like WTC 93, hang on a second, okay. Bush and Cheney could not have done them. They weren't in power then. So my point is, if you go after Bush and Cheney, if you focus on Bush and Cheney as the authors of the 9/11 attacks, you kind of miss the guys who did Oklahoma City. All right? It's my feeling, I don't know what you guys feel, it's the same guys. Right? And there's a reason that they did it, and we'll go into that. Now, Jerry talked about the Federal Reserve Bank. Who here has seen the Money Masters? Okay. All right, guys. Personally, I'm not selling anything. I don't make a penny off anything that's sold. But I think they're selling the Money Masters DVDs over there. Do yourself a favor and get one today. It explains a whole lot about the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve, by the way, is not a government entity. It's a private corporation. Okay, how many people knew that already? Can you just show a hand just so I know who I'm talking to? Okay, that's why you're here, I guess, right? Okay. All right, and it was set up so our government gave permission to these private bankers that they print our money for us. They can print our money. There's a system. They kind of have to go through the Treasury and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it takes a while to explain. Just very briefly, they buy bonds and securities, and they pay for it with nothing, with the ledger debit, okay? And that money that they buy bonds with, that gets converted into paper money, and then they could lend out 10 times as much as they have on deposit through the fractional reserve system. So the money was created out of nothing to begin with. It's not backed by gold or silver or anything. And it's created, but not even by an element of our government, but by private bankers. And when they lend it out 10 times more than they have on deposit. We pay that back, the American people who borrow the money, and we pay the interest. The interest goes into the pockets of the people who have control of the Federal Reserve, the private bankers. Okay? I don't know how many of you saw America Freedom to Fascism. Okay, I guess a lot of people. If you haven't, that's another one you have to see, in my opinion. But what it tells you is that the income tax that's collected, you guys have been paying income tax all your life, am I correct? Because I know I have. None of that income tax money goes to the things that you think it's going to go to building roads or education or whatever else you think it goes to. It goes to pay off the interest on the debt that should never have been here to begin with. Okay, because the debt it's a magic trick. So all the income tax that we've been paying over all these years, billions and billions of dollars, goes into private bankers' pockets who don't work for the federal government, who have no connection with the American people, and who do not have our interest in mind. They have their interest in mind. Okay? And that's why our country is basically bankrupted. All right, so I just want to cover a little bit about the Federal Reserve. I see a lot of people kind of know the basics already. If you haven't, please see the Money Masters, and there's a lot of great information out there you could read on the Federal Reserve System. All right, so anyway, so we're talking about 9/11. How does all this tie into 9/11? Because that's what we're all here for out in Arizona. Well, again, we're talking about 9/11 is not the disease itself, it's a symptom. It's a final phase of a plan that's been going on for a long, long time. And I believe that basically what the few people, and I think they're the people that own these central banks throughout the world, what they want is to have a world government. And they've been trying for this for a long, long time, okay? So where does this story begin then? Well, a lot of people will say it's with the Rothschild banking family from back in Europe who controlled half the world's wealth by 1850. Or some people say, no, go way back before that. It's the Masons. The Masons go back, centuries. Some people say it's the Knights Templar. They ran all the banks back in the Crusades. And some people will tell you, well, this whole problem started back in Babylonia, 4,000 years ago, in Babylon. if you're trying to pin down the source for 9/11, I think going back 4,000 years is a bit of a reach. Okay, so I think we should take it back about 100 years to where the Federal Reserve got its start. Okay, how many people here have heard of the name Edward Mandell House? Plenty. Okay, good. All right. Edward Mandell House is from Texas. His father Thomas made a fortune in the United States as a lending agent for the London banks, which preferred to remain anonymous, but it was widely believed that he represented the Rothschild Consortium. I'm reading here from an excerpt from G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is another thing I think I heartily recommend. So it was widely believed that he represented the Rothschild Consortium in London banks. He was one of the few in the South who emerged from the war between the states with a great fortune. Okay, so that was Colonel House's father, Thomas. Okay, now Colonel House was a kingmaker. What he did was he basically found Woodrow Wilson, who was a pliable puppet. Okay, and he was responsible for getting Woodrow Wilson elected. He got the J.P. Morgan group behind it, and through the Morgan group and through some political chicanery, they managed to get Woodrow Wilson elected 28th President of the United States. Okay, now, let's leave that where it is for a second and go back to London. Because London and Europe has a big connection with what's happening with globalization and with the forces that I think are trying to take over the world right now. When you go back to London, who's heard of Cecil Rhodes? Anybody? Okay, all right, good. All right, Cecil Rhodes was financed by the Rothschilds, and he was a guy who went down to Africa and started all the diamond mines. He made an incredible fortune. And when he died, part of his will was that part of that money was supposed to go to form something called the Round Table. Now, the Round Table was, I guess you could say, a league of extraordinary gentlemen. Lord Milner, Rothschild, A.J. Toynbee, a lot of people in a very, very, very high upper echelon of British society. And what Cecil Rhodes wanted to do, he had a couple goals. One of them was to recolonize the United States, which they're just about have done, you know. And another one was to have these few guys, like I said, these League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, run the whole world. It was going to be a gradual process that was going to take generations and generations to do, but they had their plans and they put it forward. A.J. Toynbee, by the way, Arnold Toynbee, who was in the Round Table, is a historian, very, very well respected historian. And what he had researched was that every time that there was a global monarchy, like the Romans or like some of the European people who actually took over the world, it never lasted. They got to the point where they took over the world, and then the tyrants basically faded away. Okay, and what he studied was that, geez, we could take over the world, and we can keep control of the world if we do it smart. So what they decided to do was get their tentacles through the media, through government, through politics, in a lot of different countries, and also to control the country's financial institutions. Okay. All right, let's focus on Colonel Edward Mandell House. So what we know so far is that he was influenced by London, by Europe. He was part of the Round Table, and he was a person who got Woodrow Wilson elected president. Now, there was another colonel called Elisha Garrison, and Garrison was the author of a book called Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law. All right, Colonel Garrison was an agent of the Brown Brothers bankers. Then later, this became Brown Brothers Harriman, and I know you guys know about Brown Brothers Harriman, right? You know, okay. Brown Brothers Harriman is a investment bank out of New York City that Prescott Bush worked for when he financed the Nazis. All righty? So anyway, this guy, Colonel Garrison, knew all about the inner workings of the financial system. He was an insider. He had entree everywhere into the financial community. So he writes about Colonel House. Colonel House also was elemental in starting the Federal Reserve Bank and bringing the Federal Reserve Plan here to America. And one of the things that Colonel Garrison writes about Edward House, so I'm also suggesting that the Central Board, this is what Colonel House said about forming the Federal Reserve Board. I'm also suggesting that the Central Board be increased from 4 members to 5 and their terms lengthened from 8 to 10 years. This would give stability and would take away the power of a president to change the personnel of the board during a single term of office. This whole Federal Reserve System is worked so it has no government oversight. There's really nobody in the government who can start changing the Federal Reserve if they want to. It's kind of a separate institution. And now the Federal Reserve Board, they're in office for 14 years. So if there is somehow a president who gets in who actually has some guts and integrity and wants to change things, he can't because he's only in office for 4 years or tops 8, and this guy's going to outlast them. All right? The Federal Reserve guy is going to be in there for 14 years. Now, in forming the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve System, there was a person who was very, who had a big presence called Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg worked in Europe for Kuhn and Loeb Company, and he was brought over by Colonel House to help form the Federal Reserve System. And he was also a Rothschild agent. And Paul Warburg, this is also from Colonel Garrison's book. Paul Warburg is the man who got the Federal Reserve Act together after the Aldrich Plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition. The mastermind of both plans was Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. So here we have an insider from the Brown Brothers Harriman Investment Bank, telling us that the person behind the Federal Reserve System was actually Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. Okay? Alrighty. So again, just a review about Colonel House. He was in with the London banks. He was part of the Round Table. And he brought Woodrow Wilson in, and he started off the Federal Reserve System with Paul Warburg. Okay? I think his spirit is with us now. Okay. And now, part 3 about Colonel House is a very interesting figure. He was also involved in, I remember I told you that part of Toynbee's plan was to get inside the media and to control the media and to control different governments and financial institutions. They rigged up groups, and I'll explain what I mean to help facilitate that. And one of these groups in the beginning, in the teens, back in the Wilson era, was called the Inquiry. All right, the Inquiry. Now, to the select few who knew, the Inquiry was the name of a working fellowship of distinguished scholars tasked to brief Woodrow Wilson about options for the post-war world. The vision that was started as the Inquiry became the work of the Council on Foreign Relations for a better part of a century. Okay? Now, this is key here, because you have a guy, again, connected with London, starting the Federal Reserve Bank, also instrumental in starting the Council on Foreign Relations. All right? Just by a show of hands, everybody who is not familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations? Good. It's okay. It's fine. Good. So everybody is basically. All right, the Council on Foreign Relations then was begun by the bankers, by the people who set the whole Federal Reserve System in motion. And what their task was, they actually met in Paris and with the people from Europe, and this was all basically after World War I ended, and they were deciding what to do with the Germans and what, how to basically go on to take the world from there. And there was 2 groups that formed out of that meeting. One was the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and that was in Europe. And another one was the Council on Foreign Relations. It's their sister group here in the United States. Luke Rukowski, the sleepy guy over there, and myself, we've done several presentations, several protests over there at the Council on Foreign Relations building in New York with Alex Jones. You can Google it and probably see that. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so one of these ideas that was stirred by these guys, and also had its roots in the Wilson era, is the League of Nations. Okay. Now, I remember being in high school and college and learning about the League of Nations, like, damn, it's too bad that didn't work out. What a great idea having a League of Nations. Well, guess what? Back in 1916, 17, 18, our country wanted nothing to do with the League of Nations. They saw the problems over in Europe. They said, let's just hang out by ourselves here. We're cool as we are, But the League of Nations had an ulterior motive. It wasn't just let's all get together and be happy friends. Okay? The League of Nations, again, was started with the idea that they wanted to form a world government. They wanted to dispense with whatever it means to be a national sovereign nation. They wanted to form a world government. And when I say a world government, again, it's not one of these utopian Star Trek things, where you have, Zulu and Oruhu and all these people, working together. It's an organization, basically totalitarian, run by a few tyrants. Okay, and that's what they want. And fellas, they're almost here. They're getting there. That's where globalization all came from. That's where the European Union came from, and NAFTA and CAFTA and all that stuff. They want to take away what it means for a sovereign nation to make its own decisions. And they want to basically put everybody in these groups that they can control financially, like the European Union, like the Euro. I mean, think about it. If France wanted to do something about the Euro, if they felt it wasn't benefiting their country, they couldn't. They can't. It's tied in with the whole European system, with the monetary system. That's not really even, no one government has any power of what to do with that currency. Got to be careful about this stuff, because then you lose your power as a sovereign nation. Okay? All right, so, world government. All right. that was about Colonel House. And again, a little review. Involved in Europe, in the Round Table, got Wilson elected, started the Federal Reserve System, which is the biggest scam ever to hit the universe, and started the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations, for folks maybe who aren't quite up to date on it, it's an organization that started in 1921 officially, now has 4,000 members. Most of your congressmen, most of your more influential congressmen, your presidents, your heads of the CIA, the intelligence groups all through the past 50 years, including like Roosevelt and so on, they were all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Okay? Council on Foreign Relations is not something you run for and you can get elected for. You are picked, you're selected because you are influential. You're picked, and you're picked, and the guys who are running it basically have sway over how you're going to take your direction. All right? So, there's a great book, if you ever want to read something that's the definitive work in the Council on Foreign Relations, is by a guy named James Perloff, and the name of the book is Shadows of Power. James Perloff, P-E-R-L-O-F-F, The Shadows of Power, which is the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Decline. Okay? And the world government, the idea of forming a world government remained the goal of the CFR for years. I think Luke might have a quote a little later about a guy named James Warburg, Paul Warburg's son, who tells the Senate defiantly, we will have world government by conquest or consent. That's what they want to do. And again, I believe, to tie this into 9/11, I think 9/11 is one of the final phases of implementing this world government. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Alrighty, okay, so what was the CFR responsible for? Well, the League of Nations failed because the United States didn't want it, But if you see the money masters, you'll realize that these same few very powerful, very influential financiers had a big hand in creating the Great Depression, had a big hand in creating the scenario that led to World War II. Did anybody realize that that Hitler was financed by bankers? We talked about Prescott Bush. Hitler was financed by people from America and by the Federal Reserve Bank, and that's how they grew. I mean, think about it. Weimar Germany in 1924, you needed a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. How does that 8 years later turn into one of the biggest powers in the world? They had to get money, guys. Okay? And who had the money? Us. So basically, see the money masters, and you'll see that these financiers were in charge of creating the Great Depression, creating basically what World War II ended up being. And one of the results of World War II, there's a Hegelian principle called problem, reaction, and solution. Problem, well, geez, the world blew up as far as all these different countries fighting each other in World War II. That's the problem. What's reaction? We have to have some kind of a connection between all the countries so that it doesn't happen again. So what's the solution? The United Nations. Created after World War II. And again, if you read that book, The Shadows of Power, you will see that the majority of the people working on the United Nations Charter were CFR. We're Council on Foreign Relations members. Okay? At the time, the land that was given for the United Nations, which is on my block, by the way, I live on 42nd Street, on 44th Street. The land that was given for the United Nations building came from the Rockefellers. Okay? Rockefellers. Let's talk about some of the Rockefellers. Talk about David Rockefeller. At the time was the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank and also the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. Very instrumental person, very influential person in world affairs, David Rockefeller. And besides giving the land for the United Nations and being the chairman of Chase and being the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, David Rockefeller also had a little idea called the World Trade Center. He was the one who developed the idea of the World Trade Center. He got the Port Authority to finance it. He basically got it built. He was the one responsible for clearing out all the buildings down in Lower Manhattan, in something called Radio Row. There used to be a lot of electronic stores and stuff. Cleared them right out. Basically had the Trade Center built. It was his idea. It was his vision. When the Trade Center was finished, the buildings were nicknamed David and Nelson. This was widely known back then in the 60s and 70s. How many people heard anything about David Rockefeller building those buildings when they came down on the news? Anybody see David Rockefeller interviewed? Guys, this would be like the Sistine Chapel burning down and nobody asking Michelangelo how he's taking it. Okay? So, I mean, it's kind of obvious that somebody should have went to David Rockefeller and said, wow, man, that was your idea. You cleared out the whole bottom of Lower Manhattan, you financed it, you built it up. How do you feel now that it's gone? So it's a little telling that nobody talks to this guy about it. In fact, you really kind of have to dig to find any kind of news about David Rockefeller at all, for anything. It's because he controls the news. My opinion, of course. Okay, so we talked about the beginning of the Federal Reserve and following the money from there. We talked about the CFR, and the CFR's goals is for a world government, and how the people who run the CFR, like David Rockefeller, are deeply rooted in the financial institutions. Okay, so let's talk about the CFR and 9/11. Let's talk about the companies. American International Group. Who's heard of American International Group, AIG? Out there. Okay, it's big. It's one of the biggest companies, one of the world's largest insurance companies. 3 of its subsidiaries are Marsh & McLennan, ACE, and Kroll, Kroll. The 3 companies who originally insured the WTC were AIG, Marsh & McLennan, and ACE. These companies then sold stakes of their original contract to their competition. It's a technique called reinsuring. Of course, when the towers went down, the competition got holding the bag. Now, the person who was a chairman of AIG for 40 years, his name is Maurice Greenberg. Okay, Maurice Greenberg is also Director Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. Maurice Greenberg was also chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. You see how this all ties in, gang? Okay. Now, his son, Evan Greenberg, was chairman of ACE, which had Kroll Associates, Kroll, as one of its subsidiaries. Kroll was one of the companies responsible for security at the WTC complex. So that kind of hooks in there too. United Securicom and George Bush, his brother Marvin was responsible also for some security at WTC. Well, so was Kroll, and that kind of is interesting because they could have done something, underhanded to get the bombs in there and so on. All right, let's talk about the Blackstone Group. In October of 2000, the Blackstone Group purchased a mortgage of WTC Building 7 from the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association. So the Blackstone Group held the mortgage. Okay, Peter G. Peterson, who's chairman of the Blackstone Group, is currently the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a former chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. You getting these connections here? Okay. And of course, when the buildings came down, and when WTC 7 came down, and the mortgage was paid off by the insurance, so the Blackstone got their money right away, of course. Okay. What else? Let's talk about other companies that benefited from basically the results of 9/11. Let's talk about Halliburton. Everybody knows about Halliburton, correct? Okay. Halliburton's former CEO was Dick Cheney, current Vice President of the United States. He was a Trilateral Commission member. Who does not know what the Trilateral Commission is? And I'll just raise your hand. I'll describe it really quickly. Okay. The Trilateral Commission is almost like a Council on Foreign Relations junior. Okay. It doesn't have 4,000 members. It has about 400. And it ties in Europe, the United States, and Japan. It's trilateral because it focuses on 3 different areas of the globe. Okay, and after the Trilateral Commission was formed, then you start things like the European Union took hold. Okay, so this is all involves planning. Anyway, Dick Cheney was also a member of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, and also was a former Defense Secretary under George H.W. Bush. So Dick Cheney's been a player for a long time, and he's in these organizations like the CFR. Also in Halliburton, Lawrence Eagleburger, Council on Foreign Relations member, Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, sat on Halliburton's board of directors. Kenneth Derr, D-E-R-R, Council on Foreign Relations member, former chairman of Chevron, currently sits on Halliburton's board of directors. Kellogg Brown and Root, another war profiteering company, is a subsidiary of Halliburton. And the workers' compensation insurance for Halliburton employees is handled by AIG, American Insurance Group, that was chaired for 40 years by Council on Foreign Relations Director Maurice Greenberg. I think they're trying to scare me. Okay. Let's talk about Bechtel, another war profiteering company. Bechtel's senior officers included George Shultz. Can you guys guess what organization George Shultz belonged to? Council on Foreign Relations, good, okay. And also Bechtel had the former Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, the late Caspar Weinberger. Okay. So what we see here is the companies directly involved in 9/11, who got mortgage money and who handled things with Silverstein and so on, had Council on Foreign Relations members at the helm. The war profiteers, Halliburton, Bechtel, have Council on Foreign Relations members at the helm. Council on Foreign Relations goes back to 21, instituted by the bankers. by the guys from the round table who had the goal of world government, to do it over a period of generations and generations, so they're almost there, okay? All righty. Let's go back to this. And let's talk about other members of the Council on Foreign Relations who had a role in 9/11. Christy Whitman, head of the EPA. Okay, a lot of Luke's and mine personal friends are actually sick and dying because they were on the pile at Ground Zero. They were on the pile because Christy Whitman came out and said, everything's safe, the air is safe to breathe. So they went out there and worked rescue operations day and night for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now they're dying of cancer. Okay, that's Christy Whitman, CFR member. Condi Rice, who was Secretary of Defense, starting these wars, Council on Foreign Relations member. Dick Cheney with the stand-down order. The order still stands, sir. Council on Foreign Relations member. Paul Wolfowitz, who was a signatory of PNAC. Everybody knows what PNAC is, Project for a New American Century. Does anybody know? Because I'll explain it. Okay. Paul Wolfowitz was signatory of PNAC, Project for a New American Century, also the Deputy Director of Defense. Okay. And Council on Foreign Relations member. Montague Winfield, you might not know his name. He was basically in charge of the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. He went out for coffee at 8:30. Didn't come back till 10:30. Left some kind of lieutenant involved. There's a new lieutenant, 2 weeks into, on the job. Can you take care of things while I'm gone? Okay. So that was Montague Winfield. Richard Myers, who was the head of the Air Force on 9/11. The Air Force who completely failed to protect our country. Richard Myers. After he is leading the Air Force during the worst failure of defending our country in the history of the country, he gets promoted to Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay? His story was that he didn't hear about 9/11 till after the towers fell and after the Pentagon got hit. Everybody here heard about it before that. So we would all be better, Air Force directors than him, okay? So anyways, he gets promoted to Joint Chiefs Staff. There's somebody named Ann Tatlock. There was a company in the towers called Fiduciary Trust. Pretty big company, handled a lot of money for a lot of rich people. Now, Ann Tatlock was a CEO of Fiduciary Trust, and she is notorious for one thing. Warren Buffett flew her on the morning of 9/11 out to Offutt Air Force Base. I think it's in either Oklahoma or Nebraska. I think it's Nebraska. Okay? And that's where President Bush landed later on when he was hopscotching around the country trying to figure out what to do. So Ann Tatlock, Council on Foreign Relations member, saved by the grace of Warren Buffett. Six of the 11 commission members, the 9/11 commission members, including Executive Director Philip Zelikow and Thomas Kane, the chairman, Council on Foreign Relations members. Does the word collusion enter anybody's mind right now? Okay, can you make these connections? Alrighty. Six. And also, we'll talk about Henry Kissinger very quick. Henry Kissinger was a longtime assistant for Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, by the way, was kind of interesting that when he was vice president for Gerald Ford, there was 3 attempts made on Gerald Ford's life. Not that I want to make connections, but okay. Henry Kissinger. We talked about AIG, American International Group. They insured the towers and so on. They were a parent company of Kroll Associates, and AIG handled the workers' compensation for Halliburton. Henry Kissinger sits on the board of directors for AIG. We talked about the Blackstone Group. Pete Peterson's Blackstone Group, which basically financed, held the mortgage on WT7. The Blackstone Group is advised by Kissinger Associates. And Kissinger was the first choice for the 9/11 Commission to head the 9/11 Commission. What happened to him is the Jersey girls went after him and wanted to know his client list, and he had to step down. All right? So between the Rockefeller connections and CFR connections, Henry Kissinger, I think, plays a big role in this. Okay, we're down to wrapping things up, gang. At least for my segment here, we're going to bring Luke up. So, in my opinion, one of the reasons this is all done is because, oil is just a part of it. Of course, they want to control the oil and control the resources. But they want, basically, to destroy sovereign nationalism. They want to create a world government with them as the totalitarian leaders. World government is not world government, ladies and gentlemen. World government is slavery. What time is it?
I got to announce it. We're changing the schedule. So
go ahead.
I'll
wrap it up right now. Sorry. Okay. World government is world slavery. Everybody know who knows about the Real ID Act? Okay, the Real ID Act has been passed by both houses of Congress, and it's on slate to be law in May of 2008. Every single one of you here is going to have to get a national ID card, probably a driver's license, with a retina scan, with tamper-proof ID, also with a microchip in it. So they're going to know where you are and who you're with every second of your life. And it's expected that these cards will also have your cash on it, because we're going toward a cashless society. That's what we are in danger of right now. That's what we have to fight. Okay? I'll finish this up in my last minute here. The way to fight this, these guys have a fatal flaw. The power elite has a fatal flaw. And their fatal flaw is their anonymity. It's their secrecy. It's not like they're Julius Caesar and they're going to try to invade our country, or we can go invade theirs. They're just a nebulous bunch of guys. They don't live in castles. They don't live in fortresses. They live in houses. That is their Achilles heel, their secrecy. They don't have their own army. They don't have their own police. They use ours. So I think every person in America who feels that 9/11 was an inside job or questions it, and there's like 80 million of us, go talk to your policemen, go talk to your people that you know in the service, and tell them about this. Hand them DVDs, hound them. Say, look, you took an oath to defend and protect the public. That's us. It's not these rich guys. Okay? I'm done. Thank you very much.
I'm not part of this panel, but I have some announcements to make real quick, and I wanted to get you guys going. The only thing I know about money is how to waste it. Okay, so.